Do you reject Satan and all of his empty promises? If you've been to a baptism using a traditional liturgy lately, you have. And there's a reason that's in there. It is because Satan's promises are, in fact, empty. Jesus told us it is not worth gaining the whole world if you lose your soul. But the whole world isn't on offer. In fact, as C.S. Lewis's wily devil Screwtape informed us, the devil delights in taking a man's soul and giving him nothing in return. The sexual revolution is an outstanding example of this. And by outstanding, I mean terrible, in the sense of it's been really bad. Its promises were that we would be happier, we would live more authentic lives, we would be more fulfilled if we got rid of the old traditions, the old taboos, the old norms around sexuality. And also, we were promised we'd have a lot of really great sex. That, it turns out, has not happened. Now, the sexual revolution won, which is why we know its promises are empty. We are now free to hop in and out of relationships, in and out of beds, in and out of marriages, even in and out of genders, as we see fit. But on its own terms of providing happiness, authenticity, and genuine human flourishing, and also, again, lots of great sex, it has failed. And it turns out, as Christians would have predicted and did predict, that there are real human costs to getting human nature wrong. That is what the sexual revolution did very badly. It got everything from our embodiment as male and female to our ultimate eschatological fulfillment wrong. And our culture has a victimhood obsession, but somehow it doesn't make it to the costs of our sex lives. We're very concerned about victims, but not about the victims of our culture's sexual revolution. And just as a point of terminology, the sexual revolution would be the movement to instantiate and implement the ideology of sexual liberation, resulting in a culture of sexual liberalism. So if I start throwing all of those around, that's what I'm trying to say. But they essentially are all tied together as part of one package. Now, the failure of the sexual revolution does give us a great opportunity. And I say us because I assume if you are here, you're probably not in favor of the sexual revolution. If you are, I kind of wonder how you ended up here. I mean, yeah, Lutheran church on a Thursday afternoon talk just doesn't make sense. Anyway, but even if we oppose the sexual revolution, Christians have been beaten down into a bit of a defensive crouch, especially, and I'm over 40 now, so I've been around long enough to have seen it. We kept losing, as I mentioned. It felt like we were in a rearguard action, and we tried hard, and somehow we just didn't win. But this very defeat gives us a great opportunity to explain to our culture why sexual liberation failed, why sexual liberalism, whatever you want to call it. We have prestige publications from the New York Times to the Atlantic routinely running pieces now exploring these themes. Now, from a secular perspective, but something has gone wrong, and they're admitting it. And so we can explain how the teachings of church, of scripture, of the Christian tradition are for our good. We can connect what the scripture teaches us with social observation, with natural law thinking, and theological anthropology in order to explain not only what has gone wrong, but also how Christianity offers a better way to live and how it might help set things right. How many of you have seen some variation on the following meme, which is basically asking older married couples, and I'm included in that at this point as an older millennial, do you feel like you caught the last chopper out of Vietnam? Has anyone seen that one? Yeah, a few maybe. But I've seen that pop up a fair bit. And the impression that that's conveying is that it's bad out there. And that's something that I've heard a lot from young women who work at EPPC or who I know at church or wherever else, from young men trying to find someone. Now, I know it's very traditional. to complain about being unable to find someone. That's been going on for a very long time. But the statistics bear this out. We have a Democratic Surgeon General who took to the pages of the New York Times to say that there is a loneliness epidemic in America. The best social science data that we have says that Americans are more likely to be living alone than at any point that we have data for. And we have the Atlantic, again, not a bastion of conservative sexual morality, of conservative Christian views on sexuality, saying there's a sex recession going on. How on earth did the sexual revolution lead to a sex recession? That was the last thing it was supposed to deliver. So somehow, something went wrong in sexual liberation. And of course, we have problems, which I'm not going to get as explicit on, but of pornography, which has become increasingly violent and degrading. And we have places like The Guardian and the New York Times writing articles worrying about the sexual practices of young men in particular being informed by pornography and how they are not only degrading, but even physically dangerous, and yet they've become normalized. So it's bad. And that's without even getting into the problems of pornography as a weird substitute for intimacy. There's the old joke about buying Playboy for the articles. Except we now have men buying OnlyFans subscriptions just to have a facsimile of interaction with a woman. That's not a sign of a healthy culture. That's not a sign of a culture that is experiencing the benefits, the delights that we were promised by the sexual revolution. And of course, AI is going to make all of this worse. When you can have your chatbot girlfriend, when you can have AI generated explicit pornography. It's already happening. It's going to get worse. And this is just piled on top of a progressive problem in the culture of men and women distrusting each other and hurting each other. A few weeks ago, the New York Times ran a column by a woman, writer about 40 years old. She and her husband blew up their marriage. They decided to have an open marriage, as it's called, which is just, I'm okay if you cheat, you're okay if I cheat. Predictably, it didn't work. She ended up getting divorced. And she then took to the pages of the New York Times, national publication, to wonder, where are all the men who are supposed to be chasing me? And not to be harsh, but you're 40. The men who are left when you're 40, for the most part, aren't going to be big on commitment. They've been avoiding it for decades now. And yet somehow it didn't click in her mind that there is a connection between what she had done, the lifestyle she had embraced, the way she had treated her marriage. It wasn't just her, it was her husband too, and her current disappointment with her dating options. And of course, there was a glamour machine selling this. Again, in the New York Times, I read it a lot. I consider it a rich source of information, although maybe not in the way its editors always intend it to be. Yeah. Anyway, there was a piece lamenting the end of the Sex and the City sequel. I've seen neither the original nor the sequel, but I was struck by a line where the writer of this piece seemed to feel that somehow the sequel had become accusatory, that it was a rebuke of those who had prioritized career and sex over family. Well, good. We should rebuke those men or women who prioritize their selfish ambitions, their selfish sexual desires over their families. But the other thing about the glamour machine is it always comes out that those pushing it were never as happy as they presented. So if you're old enough, you may remember Brooke Shields, and I think we all kind of knew at the time. She was a young actress in the 80s for the younger crowd here. I think we all knew she was being sexually exploited and wasn't happy. But for the millennials, I think it was a little bit of a surprise when Paris Hilton admitted that she spent her 20s not really enjoying her sexual freedom, regarding sex as something of a chore. So even those selling the illusion tend not to be enjoying the illusion nearly as much. And we have the odd, at least from the perspective of the secular culture that has embraced the sexual revolution, the very odd truth that statistically speaking, it's married, church-going Christian couples who report having sex more frequently and being more satisfied with their sex lives. I thought we were a bunch of repressed, prudish people who, had disappeared into a bleak suburban existence, never to be heard from again or something. And yet, from a Christian perspective, this makes sense. Even from a perspective that is secular, but stops to think about it, it makes sense. So the first problem is that the sexual revolution, sexual liberation, misunderstood who we are and what we are meant for. This is a Christian critique. It did not reckon adequately with the realities of our embodiment as male and female. We'll come to that more in a moment. But fundamentally, it presumes that we are defined by desire, that we are fulfilled when our desires are met. But the thing about desire is that it's insatiable. We always find ourselves wanting more, always looking for more. And what actually fulfills us is love, relationships. It is other people that fulfill us. And to be fulfilled by other people, we have to be in relationship with other people. And that means that we have to treat them as people. It sounds very simple, and it is. But there is something about the desire to use the other person, that dehumanizing part of our nature that our culture encourages us to implement, that is self-defeating. And we see this self-defeating nature of selfishness and again and again. And that's why we have those odd findings that University of Sociology professor Brad Wilcox in particular likes to highlight. It's somehow the married Christian couples who are sexually more satisfied. And that makes sense. Also, even if we set aside all this talk about fulfillment and love and what we're meant for, simply because, well, sex requires a partner. And practicing may also help with satisfaction. So commitment turns out to actually be very good for your sex life. It provides you somebody. Now, of course, monogamous marriage is much more than just finding a sexual partner, but it is part of that. When you get up for your wedding ceremony, you are vowing sexual exclusivity with that person. We don't think about it in those terms very often. It's a little weird, but it's an essential part of Christian marriage. And the Apostle Paul has a variety of things to say about it. And so what we see is that Christians are not scolding killjoys. We're not hateful bigots. We're not repressed prudes. Rather, we might be, but Christian sexual morality isn't. Christian sexual morality is about protecting, promoting, and preserving genuine human goods. It is about restoring sex to its God-given, God-designed place in the creation order. And we can see this in the first sexual revolution, which was Christianity's overcoming of pagan sexual culture. This revolution won, it was true, but two, because pagan sexual culture was cruel. It was exploitative. It discarded people. It treated people like they were worthless. And there was a definite hierarchy to it. And those who were exploited didn't want to be exploited. Those who sympathized with the exploited didn't want them to be exploited. And Christianity overcame the cruelties of pagan sexuality with love, with a promise that there was a better way to live. And our culture has its own discarded, most notably those killed by the violence that is inherent in the sexual revolution. That is abortion. The sexual revolution required abortion because otherwise you cannot have commitment-free sex. You always need it as a backup. And this is why we see the anomaly, it would seem, of abortion being required even as we finally see rates of sexual activity declining. Well, the simple reality is that marriage is the great protector of human life. Those who are hooking up are having less sex on average than married couples. But that sex is happening in circumstances where a child is unwelcome, a child is unwanted, a child will have to be disposed of. But there are consequences to this beyond simply the elimination of the innocent human lives. We see the false anthropology of the sexual revolution at work again, in particular, a false idea of independence. Sexual revolution embraced the liberal idea that the ideal human person, the normative human person, what it means to be most fully human, is to be autonomous, to be independent, to be free of any unchosen obligations. Well, what does that do for children? What does that do for women? What does that do for men who are disabled or hurt? What does that do for anyone, really, except someone who is fit and healthy and earning a good salary? Because the truth is, we are all dependent at some point in our lives. We come into this world dependent, and most of us will leave this world dependent. But in particular, the ideology of the sexual revolution that prioritizes independence and autonomy inherently degrades women because it suggests that the asymmetry that is inherent in human sexual reproduction, the fact that men do not have to carry and nurture a human inside of them for 9 months, men do not have to give birth, men do not then feed children from their own bodies, that all of this dependence is somehow making women less than the ideal of what it means to be human. And it, of course, attacks the humanity of the children because they are dependent. They make their mothers more dependent, and there's a problem there. Of course, the truth, as we know from Christianity as well as simple observations, that we're all the violinist. If you are unfamiliar, there's a famous analogy proposed by Judith Jarvis Thompson back in the 70s, I think. But a justification for abortion. Imagine hooking up a concert violinist to your body. You're kidnapped. A bunch of music enthusiasts from the local symphony booster club or whatever hook you up to a violinist who's dying, and your body will sustain the violinist for 9 months until said violinist recovers. And I have to say, it is a great illustration of the capacity of moral philosophers to get really weird. Because this does a great job of making the ordinary process of human reproduction seem alien. This is something from science fiction. And that's why it fails. It no more tells us about the nature of the human person or abortion than The Empire Strikes Back or Ender's Game or any other science fiction classic. Because the truth is, there's nothing alien about the dependency of those in utero. There's nothing alien or wrong with the burdens and the joys that women have from pregnancy, that special bond as well as its special burdens. It's only a problem for a movement that presumes that we must be maximally free to be authentically human. And here we see, again, the incoherence of sexual liberalism at work, which is that instead of, we were promised love, pleasure, and flourishing. Instead, there is death. We are encouraged to think of solidarity, but instead, abortion responds with violence to the most vulnerable. The primeval union of mother, father, and child becomes a deadly battleground, and there is that closing off of oneself to the essential need of the other. And again, it's a rejection of the realities of human embodiment, a rejection that we see reach its culmination in the gender revolution, which, again, we were promised that sexual pleasure was the goal and we would have lots of it. And yet somehow the sexual revolution led to something that destroys sexual function. It led to castration, to self-castration. And there are many victims of this. We have, thankfully, people who have been hurt by this speaking out powerfully, and we're starting to see some progress there. So, Chloe Cole is perhaps the most famous, but we also have, I believe, following right after me, another woman who will speak to the evils and the harms of gender ideology and what it has done. And I'm looking forward to that. And we've seen the victims. I'm going to rush through this bit a little because we don't need to reiterate men in women's spaces, men in women's sports, men in women's prisons. And we also don't need study. Well, we have studies at this point and we can point out how this is founded on junk science. But we don't need that. It's just bad metaphysics. The idea that somehow you can be born into the wrong body is ridiculous. Where is the you that is born into the wrong body? Do you have a soul that has a gender that pre-exists you? That's superstition. That's not science. What's really at work here, though, is a rejection of the normativity of human embodiment. The belief that our bodies have a purpose, that they have a meaning, that they have a function and a form. And it is also a rejection of the belief that medicine is directed towards health, rather than medicine as a technique to be used for the fulfillment of the desires of the autonomous, self-actualizing patient. It is a rejection, it is an embrace of the idea of self-creation and self-definition. It is a rejection of the idea that you have a givenness to your nature, a givenness that comes from God. And this is why so many of the people who are seduced by this ideology, in particular of late, have been young women who are hurt by our culture. I ran through some of the problems with our sexual culture. It's no surprise a lot of young women who are hurt by this don't want to be young women anymore. But ultimately, this rejection of the body is set against three central Christian doctrines. First, the doctrine of creation, which is that God made us male and female, and that this is his design. But second is the doctrine of incarnation. Christianity is unique because it says that God had a body. God has a body. God will have a body, world without end. Amen. The second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, I'm going to start quoting the Nicene Creed, but, came down from heaven for our sake, right? Incarnate of the Virgin Mary. God has a body, and this matters for our understanding of the body because our bodies are ourselves. We are not souls that happen to inhabit meat sacks that we can reshape as we feel like it. Instead, we are that union of body and soul. And we see this, most importantly, modeled for us in the fact that God himself, again, in the person of Jesus Christ, took on physical form. And then finally, the resurrection of the dead. I just mentioned the Nicene Creed, closing of the Nicene Creed. Look for the resurrection of the dead in the life of the world to come. Amen. We will have bodies in the life of the world to come. And to say that we can be born into the wrong body raises a lot of odd questions about, well, does that mean you get a different body? Not just a glorified, resurrected body, but if you're a man, will you have a female body, whatever that looks like in the world to come? Again, bad metaphysics. And ultimately, it's rooted in this rejection of the nature of our bodies and of who we are. But this didn't come from nowhere. It came from, a long train of abuses and bad ideas, but immediately preceding it, same-sex marriage, which set the stage for the gender revolution. And now we have people like Andrew Sullivan, one of the most prominent advocates for same-sex marriage, took to the New York Times recently, and before that was writing on his Substack and places like that, to say, I didn't mean it to come to this. I wanted same-sex marriage, but same-sex marriage did not have to lead to this abolition of men and women, except it did, right? If we deny that male and female matter in marriage, why on earth would they matter anywhere else? If male and female only matter as far as they are subjective objects of what you want to do sexually, why on earth would they matter anywhere else in the culture? Why would we care about them? So you can only, right, if you want to assert that same-sex marriage is no big deal, you're presuming that male and female are interchangeable, and that has a host of implications. Sullivan didn't want that. A lot of people didn't want it. I mean, I'm grateful, very grateful for our allies, whether they're liberals, whether they are trans-exclusionary, radical feminist lesbians. I'm grateful for every ally we can get. But we can't allow the fact that we have allies who disagree with us keep us from airing those disagreements, because ultimately the truth of human nature matters. And if we want to pretend that male and female don't matter in marriage, that they don't matter in our sexual practices, that there's no normativity to those differences, it's going to eventually bring us back to the gender revolution, to transgenderism. And furthermore, where do these things come from, right? I would say this is a contemporary reference, but it's a decade old by now, at least. But the Lady Gaga song, Born This Way, taught a generation that your sexual identity, your sexual desires are innate. But that was just a catchy tune on top of something that everyone in the culture was already proclaiming. One of the implications of that, again, if you're born this way, it should be affirmed, shouldn't it? So then we come back to transgender children, sexualized children, gay children. Because if your desires are utterly innate, and if that is the most authentic expression of who you are, of course it's coming for the kids. It was always going to end up coming for the children if our sexual desires are the heart of who we are. Saint Vincent, the singer-songwriter, not an actual saint, although we can always pray for her, we may hope. But as she put it, I can't turn off what turns me on. That is our culture's mantra, that what I desire sexually, what I want, is who I am. And certainly, sexual desire is powerful. It seems important. It seems even essential. But it leads to bondage. We just sang an hour ago about being oppressed by sin. And the nature of sexual liberation is slavery, because defining ourselves by the desires of our flesh is slavery to desire. We could look at 3 different views of sexual liberation to see this. First, there is the modern view of sexual liberation. Sexual liberation means being free to do what I want sexually as long as I'm not infringing on anyone else's autonomy, as long as I have their consent. Then there is the ancient pagan philosophical view, which is that, well, this is enslaving. It's enslaving to desire, because you should be a rational person who is ruled by your rational nature, as opposed to a person who is governed by your fleshly wants and longings. And the Christian would look at that and say, that's good. That's a step in the right direction. But it doesn't go nearly far enough. Because from a Christian perspective, the failure of sexual liberation, of this whole sexual revolution, is that it doesn't liberate us from our real bondage, which is to sin. A false anthropology and a false solution is to say reason can solve the problem. We need to be in control. Christianity doesn't say we need to be in control. It says we need to be remade. We need to give up control. It's not just that we can't get enough of what we want, or that we're not rational enough about governing our desires, but that we want the wrong things. And so these failures to understand the true nature of the person lead to additional wrongs. We hear talk about social justice. And that's good, in a way. We should have social justice. We should pursue it. But the truth is, there is no social justice without sexual righteousness. The best anti-poverty program, the best anti-crime program, the best educational program this country could possibly have would be if fathers married the mothers of their children, preferably before having them, but still, regardless, that would be the best thing this country could do on a host of issues, better than any amount of money, better than any amount of social workers, better than any amount of criminal justice reform, education reform, anything else. The truth is that a real love for our neighbor requires sexual restraint. And this is something that is available for everyone to see. Christianity has a lot more to say about it, but it is clear, and this is where we have an opening to speak to a world that is hurt, to speak to a world that is lost, that Christian sexual morality isn't arbitrary. It's for our good. It's for the good of those around us. Because again, it directs us towards our flourishing, it directs us towards love, and it directs us towards self-control. And as we make this case, I think we could take a lot of encouragement from John the Baptist. John the Baptist came into this world as a witness to the sanctity of unborn human life. It wasn't just a witness to that, but John the Baptist rejoiced, while a fetus, in the presence of the embryonic Jesus. He leapt in his mother's womb, the Gospel of Luke tells us, for joy at the presence of the incarnate God as a human embryo. And if God was incarnate in the person of Christ as a human embryo, the hypostatic union means that that was fully divine, fully human. And because the humanity of Christ was like ours in everything but sin, writer of Hebrews, that means that the human embryo is fully human. The human embryo is my neighbor. And then at the end of his life, what was John the Baptist martyred for? John the Baptist wasn't martyred as a witness to Christ's divinity. He proclaimed that earlier on. John the Baptist was not martyred as a witness for the early church. John the Baptist was martyred for marriage. He died for saying, you cannot take your brother's wife. Marriage is sacred. It is sacrosanct. It is something holy. And here we have a true understanding of marriage. Marriage, ordained by God before the fall, is both a foundation of this life, it is a pinnacle in this life, and is a symbol of the life to come. Marriage is dishes. Marriage is diapers. Marriage is trying to fix the dishwasher at 10:30 at night after a lot of soap suds appeared on the kitchen floor. Ask me why I've got a Band-Aid on one of my fingers. Well, you don't need to anymore. But marriage is that. It's just a partnership in the basic realities of life. And it is a partnership, it is a vocation most of us, not all of us, but most of us are called to. But marriage is also something that provides some of the most intense joys, some of the greatest intimacy that we can have in this life. It requires commitment. We can't sit around and endlessly entertain different possibilities. We can only have it if we commit to the one and forsake all others. We must move from potentiality to actuality. It requires foreclosing all the other possibilities. But if we do that, we will find, if through God's grace, that marriage can be one of the greatest blessings in this life, something that provides us some of the greatest love. But finally, it is a symbol, and this is for all of us, including those who are not called to the vocation of marriage or who have been left out of it for whatever reason. Because, again, we see marriage points us to our union with Christ. The eschatological fulfillment of Christ in the church is described as a wedding feast, as a celebration of marriage. Because of that, the intensity, the intimacy, the glory of that union. And so Christianity offers a better way for us to live. And this is what we can present to a world that is confused about how men and women are to come together, what it means to be a man and woman, whether there are even such things as men and women. Now, it is more difficult, though. To take an example from cinema, things that are difficult or that are better tend to be difficult. So Groundhog Day. The selfish Phil Connors, who could do whatever he wanted with no consequences, despaired. The Phil Connors, who wasn't only self-improving, but was self-giving and self-sacrificing, he was finally happy and free. And I think that is a beautiful picture. It is when that echoes Christ's words to us. Those who lose their life will find it, whereas those who seek their life will lose it. It is when we give of ourselves that we find ourselves, that we are fulfilled in ourselves. So this is the Christian view of of relationships in general, but in particular of marriage, of family life, those intimate, those close relationships. It is when we work with and love those and give ourselves for those that we find a deeper, fuller way of life. And it is a better way of life, but I do want to sound a note of caution here. It's not a sexual prosperity gospel, right? It's very easy to look at the numbers that Brad Wilcox crunches about Christian married couples' sexuality. And it's easy to say, great, that's awesome. But it doesn't work that way for everyone. It's a probability, it's not a certainty. There are people who will be in bad marriages. There are people who will be abandoned by their spouses. There are people who will suffer in a commitment that it turns out it's for sicker, it's for poorer, it's mostly for worse. And so we have to reckon with the problem of the vulnerability of love. C.S. Lewis put it very well. To love is to be vulnerable. To extend yourself beyond another is to both make yourself a hostage to them in the sense that they can hurt you more than anyone else can, but it is also to be hurt by what hurts them. And so while we may point rightly to the fact that Christian marriage avoids a great many of the pitfalls and problems of a broken culture, that it avoids the pains that are self-inflicted by sin, we have to recognize that it still has sorrows of its own. And the truth is, our marriage vows are a promise of till death do us part. The very best marriage is going to end with one spouse weeping at the deathbed or the graveside of the other. But it doesn't end there. Our suffering and sorrow can be sanctified. They can redound to God's glory. And in this, we follow the example of Christ. Love means vulnerability. Well, the divine vulnerability that went to the cross is the ultimate example of this. God himself, in the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, became maximally vulnerability, suffering the Father's wrath out of love for us. So this is the romance of marriage. It is to bind ourselves with vows, to sacrifice ourselves for love, and telling the world to go to hell if it comes to that. It's not vacillating or dithering endlessly over choices. And there are a lot of them. Dating apps have turned finding a spouse, finding a partner, even finding a hookup into Amazon. But no, the real affirmation of human agency isn't in endless looking, it's in choosing. And it is in keeping to the promises that you have made in that choice. And these are the promises that are the ultimate rebuttal. We reject Satan and his empty promises. We reject the failure of these empty promises that we see in sexual liberalism. But God's promises are true. By God's grace, our promises in our marriage vows can also be true.
Thank you, Dr. Blake.
I'm curious if you have a thought about, I've seen this decline in sexual behavior between young men and women being attributed to pornography, sex bots, COVID, Facebook. And I'm just curious why nobody seems to bring up the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I would think that would have had something to do with it. Your thoughts?
So I think, first of all, the reasons you've given initially are the one. You're right. Those are the ones that are commonly given, and I think they're accurate. I think in terms of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I would like to see that have an effect. I think we'll need some better data at a state-to-state level. Part of the problem that we have there is that abortion is still relatively easy to obtain, even in states that have restricted it and have managed to sustain those restrictions. As we've seen, recent cases in Texas in particular highlight the extent to which abortion is now something that is done away from the clinic. It used to be shut down the abortion clinic and you've stopped most abortions. Now it's a problem of the abortion pill is coming in through the mail, and that is difficult and challenging for us. So yes, there should be an effect, and that's part of what we actually see in the broader culture is that, ironically, abortion enables a lack of commitment. Abortion furthers many of the problems it claims to solve, and in particular, it makes it so that men feel like they do not have to commit to their sexual partners. I don't know that Dobbs in the overturning of Roe versus Wade in that decision have had an effect yet, and at least I don't think I've seen any data on that.
Earlier, you talked a bit about how this is the loneliest that Americans have ever been. Do you think that as our hypersexualization of everything has kind of almost eliminated any room for friendship? You know, you can't have, in fiction, for example, any characters that live together. You know, I'm thinking like Bert and Ernie nowadays, that people consider them homosexual. Is that also a factor that is leading to that loneliness? It's just you can't have a common relationship that isn't based around sex, but at the same time, you can't maintain any kind of sexual relationship with people.
I certainly think it's the case that male friendship and male friendship that expresses emotion is something that is now viewed as covert homosexuality in our culture. It's very hard to imagine the sort of earnest expressions of affection between men that you'll find if you go back 100, 150 years in people's letters or writings being viewed as anything other than covert homosexuality. I mean, Lord of the Rings being a great example, you'll have people reading homosexuality into the relationship of Frodo and Sam, or Merry and Pippin, or whomever else, but it's simply that expressions of male affection were accepted then in a way that they aren't now. Whether that has an effect in terms of loneliness, I'm not sure. I think that roommates are still a fairly common thing, and I'm not sure that's viewed as somehow gay or whatever for either men or women. I do think that there is a problem in that we have not sustained the cultural and social circles that bring men and women together very well. That's something that's been largely lost. I think that's something where the church really has a role to play as one of these few spaces in our culture where there is still accountability, where you can still meet someone not online and you can have that person vouched for by people whom you trust. And if they violate that trust, they might be held accountable. But I don't know that simply that in itself is directly contributing.
Thank you for your talk. My question is about sexual education in public schools. Do you think that the introduction of sex ed in public schools has contributed to these problems? And do you think that removing it from public education could possibly mitigate some of these issues?
Well, certainly, because I've seen to a large extent who writes the curriculum for the public school sex education classes and who teaches the curriculum, whether they're, and that's speaking very broadly, but when you have, say, Planned Parenthood contributing heavily to a sex ed curriculum, that's going to be a problem. And in particular, the mechanistic view of sex education that tends to prevail, even if you don't have open partisans of the sexual revolution writing the materials, is still a problem, because ultimately sex education should be connected to virtue education. And that's something that in our current climate, in our current understanding of public schools, is simply not going to happen in most places. So would removing it at this point help? Maybe, but it certainly was a major contributing factor to how we got here.
My question is, because our young people have gotten so many mixed signals about sex, is there a need to teach them how to have healthy same-sex relationships? Because for many of us, our first best friend that we loved was someone of the same sex. And so we had close relationships with someone of the same sex. We didn't wonder if we were gay because of those relationships. And today, young people would question, I believe, whether or not the fact that they have a best friend of the same sex, does that mean that they should marry that person?
I don't know to what extent that happens, although I certainly think that the more we have normalized, what we teach children is normative, certainly plays a factor. And to the extent that we have presented sexuality as something that is disconnected from the male-female reality of our embodiment, that's a problem. And I do think that there is that problem, particularly with boys, I think, of the abolition, to a large extent, of same-sex spaces, of where men are and boys are allowed to develop as men and boys by themselves. I think male bonding is very different than female bonding. One way I've heard it expressed that I think is true is men bond shoulder to shoulder, women bond face to face. It's a generalization, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. So yeah, men need spaces to go off and, things like the Boy Scouts, for example, which was for a long time sort of a haven of this. And then it got into trouble because it didn't want to allow women and it didn't want to allow homosexual scout leaders. So we have certainly gotten rid of a lot of those spaces. To what extent that confuses young children with regard to their sexuality, I can't say for sure. But certainly I think it confuses them in a lot of other ways.
I think when you were talking about abortion, you described the embryo as vulnerable. And then in abortion, we're sort of getting rid of that. So I wonder if you could extend that, what your perspective would be into the realm of like fertility intervention and IVF surrogacy, where we're creating lots of embryos to either be left in a freezer or, they fail or just what are your thoughts around that idea?
My thoughts on that are, and this is coming from someone who's a member of the PCA, the Catholic Church is right. And I think that is the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church is probably of the major Protestant evangelical denominations the one that comes the closest to that view in terms of not only recognizing that the embryo is our neighbor from conception on, but also warning about the risks of separating the sexuality, the self-giving physical intimacy of husband and wife from the act of procreation, how it goes from something where we are begetting to something where we are making.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering about the rates of marriage in society in general as compared to the Christian church or cults like the Mormons who say wonderful things about marriage.
So the lesson on that is that you really need to control for how devout somebody is. So if you look at, and it's an imperfect measure, but it's a pretty good one, which is how often do they go to church? So church-going evangelical couples, for example, have divorce rates that are much lower than the general population. Whereas those who say they are evangelical but rarely or never attend church tend to have divorce rates much more in line with the general population. Likewise, that's just going to apply to marriage rates in general. insofar as if you are regularly attending a Christian church that holds to orthodox teaching on human sexuality, you're more likely to be married. And if you're not married, you're more likely to be living a life of chastity. But if you're not going to church, then what you say you identify as doesn't matter nearly as much statistically. And I don't know about the Mormons as such.
Thank you once again, Dr. Blake.